Okay, friends, this is the next part of an earlier podcast. If you missed the first part, go check your Gritty Bowman library for the earlier part.
What are the elk doing? Are they feeding? Are they heading to bed? Are they, displaying a ton of rutting activity? I try to figure what are these elk doing. If I don't bother these elk for the next hour or 2 hours, what's their game plan? Are they feeding across the slope into a patch of timber that I can see over here that's got bedding? Are they coming out from bedding to feeding? And so I ask myself that question really quick before I start an approach or try to find landmarks or do anything, because that's going to affect what I'm going to do and kind of my strategy. One of the most important steps is to calling in a bull. If calling in a bull is your goal, is getting set up in the right spot that's going to take the least amount of effort to get that bull within bow range. So as I've glassed or located a bull, whether he's answered me, whether I've saw him with my binoculars, I'm trying to make a game plan on where I need to set up. Do I need to be in front of these elk? If it's going to take me an hour to drop through this canyon and get back up, where are they going to be in an hour? If it's going to take me 10 minutes, where do I need to be? And then I'm trying to pick landmarks out before I take off. So I'm doing all this in about 10 or 15 seconds because I don't got a whole lot of patience, and I'm usually gone before we can think about it for too long. So once I spot a bull, I'm trying to do all this or hear it. I try to make the best judge. If I hear a bull, I'm trying to pinpoint his location within 100 or 200 yards from where I heard it, and then not call anymore, so he kind of stays where he's at. We do use a lot of GPS. If I can't see the terrain I'm in, or if it's too steep, a lot of times I'll look at my GPS and say, well, we've got kind of a bowl, we've got a flat down here, chances are he's down there, and then I won't make another call until I'm within 100, 150 yards of where I think he's at. We talk about being a threat when you call a bull in. In my opinion, and from my experience, the closer you can get to the bull or his herd, the chances of you calling that bull in also go up exponentially. If I'm trying to call a bull in, I have called bulls in from 300, 400, 500 yards away, but the closer you can get to that bull, the more of a threat you pose, and in my opinion, the better chance you have of triggering that fight or flight response of that bull and getting him into bow range. So I'm trying to figure out a spot where it's going to get me within 100 yards of either his cows or him before I'm going to make a peep. So this is all stuff that I'm deciding after I've located or heard him. My goal is to be within 100 yards of the herd. On many setups, I've bumped cows. We'll be walking into where we think they are, and we've ended up either bumping cows or seeing cows first, and then that's usually close enough. If your goal is to kill, we've talked about goals earlier. If your goal is to kill a herd bull, I'm pretty confident that 95% of herd bulls aren't going to be called in unless you're within that magic 100-yard bubble. You just aren't a threat to them. If I walk into a bar and Aaron's got a pretty lady or a couple pretty ladies over in the corner, and I walk in from the door and yell at him, hey, I'm going to come whoop you and take your ladies, he's got a chance to go out the back door. If I go over to Aaron from here and say, hey, here we are, he doesn't have really any chance besides to punch me in the face or deal with me. And that's...
I think the 100-yard is the poke in the chest for me in a bar fight, right? A guy in the back can call me whatever he wants, and I'm too lazy to go over there. But if a guy walks up and pokes me in the chest, there's a problem. Well, that 100-yard is the poke in the chest to me. In my limited experience of seeing giant bulls die, we were poking them in the chest inside of 100 yards to piss them off. And it's the same way with a human, I feel, where a guy from a long ways away saying, I'm going to kick your butt. Whatever, dude. It's the same kind of a thing that I've seen.
Yeah, and then we'll get into calling strategies here. But yeah, in my opinion, you need to be close, especially to kill a herd bull. Now, you can call a satellite bull in for miles. They're pretty curious. You tend to be pretty aggressive with the cow calls, maybe throwing some small bull bugles. And you definitely can call in satellite bulls from a lot further distance. Big bulls just got so much more to lose. They're already dealing with the nature of a herd of elk. That big bull is constantly warding off satellite bulls, spikes, bulls that he can actually physically see. What makes that bull think that he needs to go address this bull that's 250 yards away? He's got real threats that he's dealing with constantly. I spent a lot of time in my college days, basically just watching elk. I was an elk watcher between bow and muzzleloader season. I took a lot of notes, and you watch a herd work that has herd bull work that has 2 or 3 satellite bulls, and he's just running himself ragged trying to take care of his herd, keep him corralled up. And so it's like, that's kind of when it triggered, like, why would a bull ever come in from 250 yards away when he's got everything to lose to these other satellite bulls? So get close. If your goal is to call in herd bulls, I feel that you need to get really close. And I don't know if I'm going to touch on it here in a little bit. Two caller setups. A lot of guys like to say, well, set the caller up at the 100 yards and I'm going to go back 50 yards. It works. I can't deny that it works, but I think there's also some downfalls to doing that. You've now just set this threat or this elk 150 yards or 200 yards away from the elk you're trying to call in, where your hunter's at 100. You've kind of taken yourself away as being a threat with that caller being so far back. I've actually called, even though we've had buddies and stuff around filming, I've called all my own bulls in to close bow range. I don't think there's a lot of holding up, and I'm going to get into setups and terrain and using it to your advantage here in a little bit. But I think by the way that I set up and kind of some of the decisions I make, I kind of prevent these bulls from holding up, from stopping. And that's a big thing. A lot of guys set up. Yeah, I talked to hundreds of guys, email me, message me. Yeah, it worked to a T. I had a bull right in my lap, but he hung up at 70 yards, or the bull hung up at 80 yards. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about when picking a setup spot are kind of ways to prevent this, and using small terrain breaks to assist you in that. Okay, setup. It's go time. You either know by him bugling, or you know by where you've located him, or where you feel you need to set up. It's time to basically get set up and ready for your call in. Or if you're a guy like Aaron, a lot of times you may continue on, and your goal is to basically sneak in on him if he's talking or whatever. But I kind of include the setup as basically when you're in kill mode, like you've got an arrow knocked, your release is hooked up, and you're ready to go. For me, how many of you guys set up behind a pile of brush when you're getting all set up? Perfect. When I was a young, dumb bow hunter, I thought, even as a turkey hunter, I knew you set up in front of stuff, let the brush behind you break it up. I don't know how many times I screwed up my first couple years of bow hunting by setting up in a big pile of brush. I've got a stabilizer that's 8 inches long. I've got an arrow that's probably 25 inches long, and the bull is never going to come in exactly where I want. So you're trying to swing a bow around, turn back to your left, and I'm set up in a big pile of brush. First thing I'm looking is a spot to set up that gives me 100% clear movement on everything in front of me. I'll use the brush behind me or a tree behind me to break up my outline. So that's the first thing I'm looking at a setup. I'm also trying to figure out which direction I think this bull is going to come from. Are there used game trails in the area? Because bulls like the path of least resistance. So if you've got a trail that's coming right to you, chances are that bull's going to come right in on that trail. The other thing I'm looking at on a setup is what's the wind doing. Wind. I don't care what you smell like, what cigarettes you smoke, how much food you've spilled on you. If you play the wind right, none of that matters. So I use a wind checker more than I use any of my elk calls. I bring four tubes of it and basically squirt it, all day long, everywhere I walk. Every little finger I go over, I'm trying to figure out if the wind's changed or is doing something different. Now I'm going to touch on wind and how I use it to my advantage. If I'm calling a bull in perfectly straight for me and Aaron, and the wind's hit me right in the face, I have no idea if a bull is typically always going to try to get wind on you. He wants to smell you. He wants to figure out if there's any danger. So if the wind's hit me right at the nose, I don't know if Aaron's going to end up over here for a shot or over here for a shot. So what I like to do is use the wind to my advantage just slightly. If I let that wind hit me on like a cheekbone, maybe at 20 degrees, I've now basically used the wind to steer that bull as a steering wheel. If the wind's hit me on this cheek, I can almost guarantee 95% of the time that bull is going to be on my left side for a shot. So I'm trying to calculate all that in. And so by using the wind to my advantage rather than just kind of a guessing game, we call it the half moon. Sometimes if I'm hunting solo or we're really tight with a buddy, if I know that's going on, I can call and then move him up in that direction, because we know he's going to probably start his circle 50 to 60 yards out and try to hook you to the left. So if my buddy wants a really close shot, I'll move him 20 yards in the, kind of perpendicular to that wind direction and move him that way. It's worked great for us. We've only had one bull that's committed suicide and came the opposite direction, but we've pretty much been able to use the wind as a steering wheel instead of trying to guess. multiple shooting lanes. Like I said, finding trails. As a right-handed archer, one thing I didn't realize until it cost me a bull is I have the ability to swing way over to my left and shoot. I have hardly any ability to swing to my right and shoot. So when I set up, I don't want to be trying to make these movements. To me, it's pretty important when you've got a bull at 20 yards trying to pick you out and figure out what's calling to him. I can't make a full body movement or shimmy around on my knees or shimmy this way. I'm trying to set up to begin with exactly where I'm going to pull the trigger. So I usually set up with a bias so I can swing a lot further to my left. If kind of like my golf game, like that. So I'm going to set up opposite and basically give myself a lot more room to swing to my left and knowing that the bull's not going to come to my right. So yeah, the wind is huge. Set up in front of brush. Draw at the right time. I've seen a lot of my buddies draw at the wrong time or draw at inopportune times. It's not really part of the setup, but knowing when and where and what you can get away with is huge. I've been pretty fortunate that I've seen horns come in, or I actually haven't had a big snafu on drawing my bow yet. I don't know if I've been lucky. I have had some bulls hang up where I've been stuck at full draw for a minute before I've been. My bull in 2011, I had to actually let down. I couldn't hold any longer. He started to take off. I called him back in and was able to redraw my bow. But
it's because of nutrition.
Yeah.
Better.
It was all the training I did.
The only thing I would say is if you're solo on the wind, the best luck I've had, it doesn't always work out depending upon your setup, is having a rise where you're using the wind to your advantage, but you can see antlers just because you're solo. So if you can get to 35 to 40 yards where he's going to be coming up to take a look at you, you can at least see the antlers before to get the full draw. You're probably going to have to shoot him in the chest or whatever, but it's hunting solo. I always try to use, whether it be a tree line, brush, something to where when he's hooking me, he is forced to come within my bow range, which doesn't always work, but when you're solo, you don't have the other caller. It's a lot easier with raghorns because they're stupid. They're coming anyway. But with most cases, if you can set up to where he has to hook you, but also has to show himself to visually see where that noise is coming from, to take a look if there's a cow in there, it's about, you almost have to do it that way to get a broadside shot, or you're going to be shooting a lot of chest. I've shot more elk in the chest in a frontal just because I hunt solo most of the time.
I've called all my own bulls in, and it's like some people cringe at a frontal. I'm not going to get into that, but I've shot my last 4 bulls with a frontal just because that's the nature of calling in your own bulls. Yep. One other thing I wanted to touch on the setup was thinking about put a little bit of thought into the wind. It seems like, I don't know if it's elk gods, Mother Nature, real God, whatever you believe in controls the wind. They've seemed to design the time that you're going to call a bull in right when the thermals are going to switch. I tend to play it pretty conservative if I need to and get on contour with the bull, 80 to 100 yards out. That way, if the wind switches somewhere in the middle of that calling setup, I'm hopefully safe. But if I'm calling a bull in, in the morning, the wind's typically blowing downhill, down valley. If I'm trying to call a bull in down the hill, and knowing that it's, well, at least where I hunt, 9:30, I almost know that this wind's going to switch. I would rather, instead of him catch my wind, I would rather be a little more conservative to start with, or I guess it's less conservative to start with and let the wind kind of hit me in the side of the face to start it, knowing that I may have the wind switch on me somewhere in between. It's also easier to call bulls in on contour than it is, up or downhill, because then, you're giving one bull an advantage. Gravity, they kind of got that figured out, that a bull approaching from the top is going to be more dominant. And so you trying to put a little bit of thought into time of day, thermals, and what the wind's going to do as well may assist in not blowing up a setup. Anything else?
No, on that one. That one's pretty simple.
Yeah, boring. Okay, we're going to get into, at least from a game call owner and strategy, elk language and what they mean or what they say. I try to avoid it just because there's tons of different thoughts and guys are successful. I try not to get too caught up on what they're saying the rest of the year. I care what they're saying now. Like I said, I was a nerd back in my college days, and I documented. I have a 4-ring binder, or a 3-ring binder that's 4 inches thick of notes that I took, basically just watching elk. Did that bull have satellite bulls? How many satellite bulls? Did he have cows? How many cows? And basically I just watched and took notes. It was what I did. It was kind of dorky, but it taught me a lot in the process of what's going on. And My argument for some of these guys that elk mean things is I've heard every bugle in the world come from the same bull on the same night with the same dynamics going on. I don't know how, there's any other way. I've heard a bull rip off a big lip ball with chuckles. I then heard that bull turn around and let out a big high locator bugle. It just, there seemed to be no rhyme or reason. And I would sometimes watch, if it was a good looking bull, I would go watch that bull 3 or 4 nights in a row. And there was just no rhyme or reason to what the cows were doing, what they were, kind of their calls. And so I don't put a whole lot of thought into what they're saying, and I don't think it's affected my success. But that's kind of my approach on elk language. And now me and Matt call in the Worlds, and we call in the Oregon State elk calling championships and stuff, and it's kind of more for show than anything. I run a call business, so it looks good if you can go be successful, but don't get hung up on being the best caller there is. I agree there are some advantages to being a good caller, but a lot of these guys, I get tons of messages or emails like, yeah, my chuckles are good, but they're just, what are you doing different? And I was like, well, send me an audio file. It's easy enough with the iPhone really quick. I was like, dude, quit. You're 90% of the way there. You're everything you need to be able to do to kill a bull. If you're not worried about competition calling, you don't need to do anything more. Everybody hears, good callers or people on video, and it's like, well, I want to do that. You don't need to be, but by being a good caller, I use mimicry a lot. I try to mimic bulls that I'm calling in, and it allows me to basically sound whatever I want to, but don't get caught up on being the best caller. Also, don't get caught up on, basically elk call companies, all their newest, latest gadgets. These elk calls have been killing elk and calling elk in forever, and I've always preached, if you sound like an elk, they're not really changing. I mean, if an elk call sounded like an elk 20 years ago, why is this new call better? Yeah, it may be easier to use, it may last longer, but there's pretty tried and true methods and calls out there that work. So use what you're most comfortable with, whether it's my brand, whether it's whether it's Bugling Bull, whether it's Barry, whether it's Point Blank. Use what you're comfortable with and what you're most confident in. A lot of guys they try to force feed themselves a call because so-and-so, the world champion, used it. Or a lot of guys try to force feed themselves my calls because I recommended them. It's not necessarily going to work. We all have different mouth sizes. We have different shapes. We apply tongue pressure different. Find something you're confident with and use it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, calls are relatively cheap on the diaphragm side. So you can afford to maybe buy a couple different brands. Buy one with a pallet plate, buy one with a dome, buy one with a flat style, and figure out what works best for you. Out in the woods, I love to hear myself bugle. I bugle all the time, but be realistic in your call length. I was talking with Jay Scott one time, and we talked about elk call length and kind of how long elk really bugle. It's like we go out there and we'll rip off a 10, 12 second bugle, and it's like, well, hopefully nothing bugled in the meantime because I didn't hear it because I was still bugling. And there's stuff to that, like I keep my locator bugle short, 3 to 4 seconds max, because I've had bulls answer instantly, or you could have bulls, I don't want to miss that. So I try to keep realistic elk sounds, 3 to 5 seconds, maybe with some chuckles or grunts thrown on. So keep it realistic. Don't go out there and hammer on a 15-second locator note because you're not at any volume, you're not reaching any elk, and you're basically doing yourself a disservice by not being able to hear everything that's out there. We'll go over some of the calls I use here, but in elk calls you have diaphragms, which are probably the most popular. It lets us as bow hunters be hands-free. You can make all sounds with certain diaphragms. Some are specific cow, some are specific bull. So you got your diaphragms, which are basically latex stretched between a frame with some waterproof tape around it that fits inside your pallet. You've got your external cow calls, which are basically have a plastic reed with a mylar reed, a plastic tone board with a mylar reed, and usually a wood or a plastic barrel. Probably the easiest cow calls to use, pretty user friendly, but they do require you to probably have your hand in your mouth or some sort of movement. You have grunt tubes, which basically are to amplify more on your bull sounds, but we'll also talk about estrus, what I consider an estrus buzz, and I do use my tube sometimes to throw that a little bit more and make it more dramatic. We also have the push calls like the Hoochie Mama, the Carlton squeeze call that work basically by force and air across the reed. Really easy to use, and most everybody can use a push call. So those are kind of the different types. We also have external bugle reeds for guys that can't use a diaphragm but still want to use a tube. Basically it allows you to bite, blow, Aron uses a Power Bugle, Elk Inc. ELK Power Bugle.
Yep. One thing I would add with Jason, just because I do these seminars a lot with guys that I usually handle the gear, and basically the same thing I'm doing now is they all have a different strategy and all of them work. For example, Corey Jacobson bugles a ton, but he's looking for, from what I've gathered, he's looking for one elk that will respond to his bugle that he can call into his lap. He doesn't really cow call that much. Chris Rowe is overly complex with his calling system, and he has a system where he thinks when you call at an animal, his idea that by the sound that you make, you're either asking for an action or you're asking for a physical response. And there's several other people, and everybody's equally lucky. I think confidence has a lot to do with what you're doing if you're making the right sound. And I'm not an expert by any means, but we call in elk every year, and I do almost opposite of what 2 or 3 guys I know that preach calling. And when we go on to private land, pretty much you can do anything you want and they're going to come running right at you. What I have noticed with some of the guys that really get into how you should be calling, where Jason's kind of trying to stay out of it. He's like, hey, whatever works for you. Well, you can, burp and have bulls come in on private land in a lot of different cases. And I know I would take advice from somebody that hunts private or public land. For the most part, if you're going to hunt public land yourself, getting advice from someone like Will Primos, he's a great guy, I know him really well. He couldn't kill an elk on public land to save his life. He never had to hunt one ever. Great guy, but he always is hunting really good, high, like a high bull ratio, very, they're untouched, so it's quite a bit different than hunting on public land. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, public land's definitely different than calling in, bulls that aren't messed with. I mean, you can kind of emulate it. If we get into pockets where there's no hunters and there's no boot traffic, it's not necessarily like hunting private land, but the bulls haven't been touched, and you can use some different strategies. But for the most part, calling in public land bulls is not typically easy. There's a little more difficult. There's a little more. That's why I like to get in their face. If nothing else, at least I'm at least 100 yards to start with before I screw things up. Where it's like on public land, if I'm 300 yards away, I've never had a chance. Where it's like if I screw things up at 100 yards, or I've at least put myself in that red zone to maybe have something happen. Well, if my calling doesn't work.
I go off of I get invited to a lot of different areas to call for guys to help out, and I can do no wrong in southern Colorado. The elk just keep on coming. Everything I throw at them's working. So I could go give you a seminar on how to call elk off of what happened in southern Colorado, but I would be lying because that stuff does not work when I go to public land. So that is a huge difference that I've noticed. And I get to call for guys, a lot on private land, and it's just completely different. Yeah,
or I mean, it's completely different on regions too. Like Jay Scott and Steve Chappell, who hunt Arizona, New Mexico country, and they're really successful, and I would take everything they had to say, but they don't bugle at all.
No.
And where my calling's 90% bugling, and so I mean, different areas, different elk. Another big factor is your bull to cow ratio. If you got a high bull to cow ratio, things are different. So take all that into account. And so I'm typically kind of preaching how I approach Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana elk calling. It sounds like Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, some of that stuff's real similar, but it sounds like when you get down south, things kind of change and strategies definitely change.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many of us hunt New Mexico or Arizona or hope to someday. So now we're going to get into sounds a little bit before we go full circle and kind of get back to any gear questions that you may have for Aron. So I'm going to go over really quick kind of my strategies, kind of the different sounds that I use. I'm a decent caller, but I'm a pretty boring caller. I use basically 3 or 4 sounds. I use a locator bugle 90% of the time until it's go time. So I'm going to hike along a ridge, I'm hiking along an old burned out road, an ATV trail, whatever, and I'm basically trying to bugle every finger ridge I get to. If I'm opening up new areas to this call, I want to try. And a lot of times I'll get to one, like 2 spots past, and I'll have a bull bugle right back to where I was. So I try to keep it, like I said, I bugle a lot, every 200 to 300 yards along a ridge or road line, or every time I get to a finger ridge and it's kind of opened up a new little pocket of terrain. So a location bugle, without, like I said, I don't pay a lot of attention to what they mean. On a location bugle, I'm trying to hit a 2 or 3 note high note. I'm not putting any voice into the beginning. I'm not really putting any voice at the end. I put a 2 or 3 note, and then I kind of cut it at the end. So here's what a typical locator bugle, and if this doesn't sound good, it's because the room's big and I'm nervous. And
It'll sound great, man. You'll be fine.
So a typical locator bugle, I try to start high, 2 or 3 notes, and then don't really growl or add any voice to it. That's it. I mean, there's no voice at the beginning. There's no growl. There's no lip ball. There's no chuckles. It's just a real high 2 or 3 note. However many notes I grab, hold it for 2 or 3 seconds, and then get out of it so I can hear. Because a lot of times, if you are on a fired up bull, he's going to answer, and he may be done, or you may miss the high note, and we can hear high notes better than deep notes sometimes. So I've always just made it a principle to be done by 3 or 4 seconds, hopefully. So that's what I'll do. Every 200 or 300 yards, I will locate and listen. Ideally, you would wait 10 to 15 minutes. I have the patience to wait about 10 or 15 seconds and move on. So, I mean, because you'll get my bull I killed last year in Idaho, I actually did locate off the road. And Charlie, my hunting partner, was eating a bag of purple Skittles. And he was crunching them and munching them, and I was bugling out the window. And I was like, dude, I just heard a bugle. He's like, no, you didn't. And bugled again, nothing. Bugled again. I was like, gosh dang it. I pulled the keys out so my truck didn't beep. I was like, get out. Stop eating your Skittles and let's go listen. So I had ended up bugling 3 or 4 more times, and finally he answered again. And it was just one of those things like that. If I hadn't had just heard that first bugle, we would have fired the truck back up and moved on. So it's one of those things where it took us another 10 minutes from once we knew he was there for him to answer again and finally make a game plan on him. So patience is good, but like I said, I don't got a whole lot of it. So if he doesn't answer within 20 or 30 seconds, I'm usually moving again. So challenge or warning bugle. This is the bugle I use when I'm in tight, 100 yards or 150 yards. I basically get in tight. I'm going to use the Estrus whine before this, but then I hit him right off with a challenge bugle. Basically, what do you want to do with your challenge bugle? My goal is to make that bull feel as small as possible. I want to be as loud as possible, as growly as possible, and grunt and chuckle as loud as possible at the end. A lot of guys ask me, well, aren't you afraid of being too loud or scaring them away? I don't know how many of you guys have had a bull bugle 30 or 40 feet in your face and then turn around and had a buddy bugle from 30 or 40 feet in your face, but the volume's off by about a factor of 4. We don't have the lung capacity. We can't produce the same volume thump, 3D realism, whatever you want to call it, that a real bull can. So I've always just hammered, and I've had satellite bulls come into 30 yards. I've had little teeny Washington raghorns come into 20 yards. It's just, I don't think it really affects it. The raghorns are curious, or the big bull needs to have this big sound in order to feel like he's threatened. So here's what my typical challenge or warning bugle sounds like. I'll growl at the beginning. I kind of taper in, and then I don't let it be clean for very long. I maybe let a clean note for a minute, and then I go back into a growl. And then I grunt or chuckle at the end. So here's what it sounds like without the tube. So I try to add voice back in the middle. So a full challenge bugle through the tube. Now, if I did my job right, a lot of times on my calling setups, I'm done. At that point, that bull's committed and I don't have to do anything. Like I said, I'm pretty impatient. Typically, I should let him sit for a minute or two and see what happens, see if he responds, but usually I pick my tube back up after 20 seconds and try again, trying to get a response, but ideally, I should probably wait. If I go 2 or 3 sequences without him answering, I'll go back to a cow call and see if that gets him to respond. If nothing, I'm usually so impatient that I'm like, hey, we're going closer. Something isn't working, we're not, either he's gone or we're not a threat. And we do run the risk of bumping elk. I mean, it's part of the deal for me. We will bump elk. If it's a giant bull or a big bull we want to go after, I'm a little more reserved. Like, do we want to screw this up right now? Because, a bull in a new area that he hasn't been, no routine's a little tougher to kill. So some of that, I mean, every situation's a little bit different, but grunt, this is the most asked question as far as calling, how do you grunt? It's 2 parts. A lot of guys will just blow basically an alarm bark, blow another one, blow another one. So you end up with something like this. It works. It's all you can do on a conqueror mouthpiece. Some of the external mouthpieces, you can't get the inhale, but in order to put a full chuckle together, that bull's also inhaling in between chuckles and getting that cadence. So not in the tube, you have an inhale. The inhale doesn't sound very loud, but when I put it into the tube, you're going to hear the difference, the cadence, and it does become an audible sound. So when people are practicing, I say, work on your alarm bark. Now make them faster. So you can kind of hear that screech when I'm breathing back in across the reed. You kind of drop a little bit. You don't want to be a high-pitched screech, but you basically need to have the inhale portion there. And so it's basically a quick blast of air, cut it off, inhale, and you're basically reloading to grunt again. Like I said, a lot of guys are actually better than they think, but they want to kind of wrap all this together. So the grunt's just a cadence. It's getting that timing down, be able to put 6 or 7 of those together, and basically mine, I typically, my second or third one's my highest note, and then I kind of taper back down. So that's a typical grunt. Usually I throw it on the end of my challenge bugle. Sometimes, depending on if it's a long calling and that bull's chuckling or grunting a lot, sometimes I'll just throw, a lot of our Western Washington Roosevelts do a lot of chuckling and grunting only, and they actually don't add the high note or the challenge bugle on the front. Another thing we get a lot's chuckle. I try not to do, basically a chuckle is just a quicker, glunkier sound without a whole lot of note added in. We use this as well. It's just, I don't use it a lot. Usually I use the challenge and the grunt, but here's basically what a chuckle sounds like. It's just quicker, knockier, not quite as much elk tone. Where a grunt's got that deeper, high-pitched thump to it. A lip ball bugle, before I started calling competition, I kind of joked around that this was a competition bugle. This really had no place in the woods, but you do hear it quite a bit. I just typically don't use it in the woods. It's the hardest bugle to use, and my hunting partner Charlie does lip ball quite a bit when hunting, and it is pretty effective. He uses it in place of a challenge bugle. Basically, what you got to be able to do is sputter your lips as you're blowing through it. So. So to put together a whole lip ball bugle, you'll transition into that lip ball out, and then grunt or chuckle on the end. So basically you got to be able to sputter your lips to get a lip ball. Like I said, I don't use it a whole lot. I just typically go with my challenge bugle that has a lot of voice inflection. Some guys do use it, and I use it because I'm a competition caller and it's something that's kind of required, but we don't use it. I kind of have a scream, which is basically the end section of a challenge bugle, and if I know I've got the temperature turned up and I have nothing else to lose and this bull's coming, a lot of times I'll just scream at him. It's a 2 or 3 second raspy blast of air is basically what it is. And so once I know this bull's committed, or he's at least turned towards me and on his way, I'll basically go into a screaming match, and that's just to basically keep the temperature turned up. Just real short blast of air, and it's, to me, I don't try to put a whole lot of meaning into it, but to me it's kind of like that punch in the face, like I'm here, I'm turning the temperature up, and you're going to lose. Alarm bark, besides hearing wolves in my hunting area, this is the last noise I want to hear. Is an alarm bark made by both bull and cows. It's basically that same, it's an excited blast of air that basically means something's up. They either know you're there, they've smelt you, they've winded you, they've seen something they don't like. Just a quick blast of air. Alarm bark, sometimes you can alarm bark and get them to hold up or stop and maybe regroup, but usually it means everything's over. And then we talked about it earlier, bull elk sounds, we do a lot of raking, stomping, picking stumps apart, snapping twigs, kicking brush, whatever we need to do to make real elk sounds. And my dad always joked that that's why he's a logger, grew up in the woods and talks about woodsmanship, and he's like, hey, bow hunting's a good thing for you because you can make as much noise as you want. I can remember being a little tyke running behind him, and he's like, you're so noisy, be quiet or whatever. And so archery hunting worked out good for me because I can make as much noise as I want, break as many sticks as I want, and be as noisy as I want. We'll go into cow sounds real quick. I do use a lot of cow talk, but a lot of times my calling setup, once I'm within that 100 yards, I use the Estrus whine, or what I call the Estrus whine. We can argue over what sound it is all day, but it's a sound, it's an excited mew, kind of drawn out. And so when I get in close with 100 yards, this is what I start the whole calling sequence off typically, and then go to the challenge bugle. It's a long drawn out call. I'll use it on the diaphragm first. It's going to be wavy. You're going to kind of go up high, go low, go back high, and then kind of drag it out. Doesn't sound a whole lot like what you think an elk mew sounds like. Everybody thinks elk sounds. I'm trying to be that cow that wants to be bred right then, you know, in order to kind of get things started. So I use an Estrus whine. This is my wood-bodied easy Estrus call. It excels, and if it's got a strong point, it's its nasally, whiny sound. It's got a real thin reed, and it works really well. So this is what like an Estrus whine would sound like on the external. So it's really whiny. It's got that needy sound. And then the pleading mew, which is basically just real similar. It's that drawn out. It's just a longer mew. It's not quite as wavy. It's just a little bit longer mew. You've got your social mews and herd talk. Cows are always communicating with each other as they move, as they feed. You'll hear that sound a lot. Calves are my favorite, at least when I hunted Roosevelts all the time. Calves are my favorite because they're annoying, they call a lot, and they will give a herd away all day long if I cow. So a lot of times I'll be riding my bike down the road and just, oh, this looks like a good spot. Let's calf call. It's really short, high-pitched sound, and almost, cows are just really vocal. And so by doing a cow call, it's basically a lot of the high note and not a whole lot of the deep note on the cow call. In 2007, I had a giant bull located. Corey Miller actually was in my hunting area, and we were kind of all going after the same bull. And we ended up busting the bull. But on that, we broke a calf off from the herd. And long story short, we were still trying to call the bull in. That calf came running into 3 yards, and I'm not joking, she called but 3 times for every step she took. When she covered that 500 yards, my old man looked at me and said she probably over 1,000 times she had just chirped the whole way in. And it just goes to show just how vocal calves are. And we've used it. I've killed 2 bulls locating from a calf call. I don't use it a lot, but I use it sparingly here or there, and a lot of times it'll get other calves to kind of chirp up. The Estrus buzz, which kind of a competition cow call, but I don't know if it was Steve Chappell or Jay Scott. They've got a video in New Mexico or Arizona of a cow that basically makes this sound. And of course it's Arizona, so albeit there's a 400-inch bull behind every tree, I think. That cow Estrus buzzes, and there are 3 bulls over, I think, 330 inches that are on that cow within a second. He's one of the first guys, I think, that video or documented that sound. And so what it is basically by growling your throat, you're going to add some buzz to the end of that cow call. I used it quite a bit last year, and it didn't hurt anything. I don't know if it was really effective, but I tried it in some situations where I didn't have a lot to lose. It doesn't really sound a whole lot like an elk, but I think 5 or 6 guys have it on video now, and it's been effective, or bulls have come into that sound multiple times. So like I said, up until 3 years ago, I never ever used that sound. I've been using it more and more now, that just because it's more documented and seems to work for guys. So that's kind of it on just the sounds. Does anybody have any questions on sounds or calls or anything? Perfect. Oh, there's one.
I know I had a lot of success years ago when a bull would hang up. I found it by, like you said, mimicking that bull. I mean, I had bulls come in totally enraged because every grunt, every
Yep.
I mean, they just do it in a rate.
Yeah, I mean, we mimic bulls all the time and try to finish his calls for him. If I'm quick enough on the call, if he starts, if he's been chuckling and he starts off a call, I'll start up right in the middle and then basically say I didn't even hear you, and then here's my grunts and chuckles right on top of yours. And yeah, it definitely seems to get him fired up. And that's, I think on both of our Idaho bulls last year, we basically mimicked that bull until he had enough. Want to open it up back to gear. We're kind of over through the strategy section. The last portion of mine is tracking. You can be as successful as you want, but until you've notched that tag, tracking is a huge portion of hunting and being successful. I don't know. There's a whole lot to talk about. We talk about gridding, basically trying to gather as much information. Paying attention to the hit. You talked about your buddies earlier that had no clue where they hit their elk. I shoot both eyes open. I do a good job tracking the arrow most of the time, and I've got a pretty dang good idea when that arrow hit exactly what I hit and what vitals I've hit and what kind of tracking job it's going to be and how long I'm going to, how much flagging I need to get out. Try to pay attention to the general direction. If I shoot a bull over here and he's heading that way for the first 100 yards, when I start to lose blood or trail, I usually typically go that direction. He's usually, if he's heading downhill, I've got a good indication that he's not feeling very good. The bull takes off uphill, I'm usually not very happy, and I sit down for a couple hours. But
see, I try to mark where I took the shot, where the animal was standing, and make sure that's very visible. If you got a GPS, turn it on. I've gotten lucky helping one bull myself and a couple of my buddies with kind of piss poor hits. I ended up going back and looking at the track log of the GPS. He was on a death run. And I was able to follow that azimuth or that direction that he was heading. I didn't walk right to him, but pretty close. We just followed that direction, and eventually we ran into him. If we wouldn't have been marking the blood trail or marked it on the GPS, we probably never would have found that bull, because it's pretty hard to go back and get an idea of an azimuth that you'd be heading out at. I would say that ribbon is kind of important with your tracking. You want to make sure and bring something to mark your track job.
And take your time. I mean, I'm really impatient. A lot of times I'll get just going and want to go too fast. And I've got buddies that are definitely more patient than me, and they're tipping over twigs. They're looking at new ferns that are folded in certain directions. Picking up specks of blood. I just usually want to go too fast, which is definitely not what you want to do. Gather as much information, make sure you're making, you're kind of evaluating all the trails, making sure you're paying attention and staying on the right track. We all owe it to the animals to do our best to recover them, and and then last resort is basically grid. And by using the GPS now, after we shoot, we basically turn it on and let it figure out where we've been, and then we can look at sections where that bull was heading 100 yards this direction. We're not really sure where he went, and that's kind of how we kind of start our grid search.
And I mean, as far as the marking, the blood trailing, other than just doing it, learning how to blood trail, obviously it's hard to explain exactly what to do. I would say a couple as far as where animals are hit, if you want to go into that. I know personally for me, with a one lung hit animal, any animal, or a muscle hit animal, I'll run them down because they're not going to die anyway unless I keep pushing blood out of them, and then we'll get another shot at them. And this isn't something I've guessed. This has happened on sheep hunts, goat hunts, elk hunts with me. They'll live with one lung unless you hit something else vital forever. For a long time. But if you can make them push more blood out, then they can rejuvenate. They're going to get weak. They're going to bed down. You're probably going to get another shot. And so I've seen my buddy hit a mule deer 12.5. It's not an elk, but he hit it in one lung. It bedded. He didn't know I could see him. I was a mile and a half back. It was a crappy thing. So I thought, well, I'll just watch this deer. And then, he's going to follow it and track it. I couldn't tell exactly what happened. That deer went 2 miles before it stopped walking on one lung hit, and he smoked it in one lung. When it bedded down, there was a pool of blood the size of that table, and then it clotted up, and it lived for probably forever. It never died. So I would say, and we didn't talk about this, one lung hit and muscle hits, meaning my buddy Jay shot one across the brisket. We didn't know that at the time. I couldn't believe it died. It was a Spitfire broadhead, open just straight across it, muscle hit entirely. We tracked that thing for a mile and a half in deadfall timber. The more deadfall we hit, the more it ripped its chest open, In fact, he had just came from Alaska, so we got up to it. It was moaning, how they do. He thought it was a grizzly, right? He thought it was a bear. He's 6'10". He starts running at me. It's a bear, dude. It's a bear. Well, we had ran enough blood out of it. It was just laying there, and it was really weak. So I'd say that's something to take into consideration. One lung hits, liver hits, intestine hits, femoral hits, which is pretty simple. They die right away. Is where you hit the animal and what you should do from that point.
Yeah. A lot of it's a knack. That one frontal shot, I knew I got in at the wrong angle in the wrong spot. I knew I had one lung, and just like you, a lot of guys say, well, it was a marginal hit. You should have shot or sat down for 2 hours. It was getting dark. I knew he was going to a Christmas tree patch, and I had no other option besides get up to him and I did get another shot in the road and shot over his back. But then he went down, and against all, I'm not trying to preach bad information, but in that situation, I knew that it was going to do me no good to let him get in a 20-year-old Christmas tree patch with brush over my head and trees so tight I couldn't walk to, because if I couldn't hear him or couldn't see him, I wasn't going to probably track him down. Fortunate enough, I was able to hear him go in there. He was breathing pretty heavily because of the lung. I was able to sit there long enough for an hour, let him get so weak that I was able to get down off my old growth stump and get another shot into him. Yeah. If I would have waited like all textbooks tell us, I would have never found that bull, because he was just in a brush pile that I couldn't walk or even back my way through.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's definitely times when you should wait, let things happen. If you think it's a vital shot, maybe got both lungs, but there's other times when there's nothing besides a gut feeling or a knack or knowing what you got to kind of tell you what to do.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say that if you, especially I've seen a couple guys where I've called in bulls for dudes who shot not a full-on frontal, but cornering two, where they tried to sneak it tight into the front shoulder. They basically ended up hitting just one lung and guts. I mean, if you're not picking up obviously the bile or the guts or whatever, usually if I find a bed relatively quickly. They'll go 200 or 300 yards and they'll bed down. They're feeling sick. Obviously gut shot animals go to water as well, but there'll be coagulated blood in that bed, which pretty much means you're screwed. You're probably not going to find it. And having that happened a few times, that's why now I run them down until at least I can see them bed again.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of it as far as the elk hunting side. Anybody have gear questions or want us to cover anything? We got the gear expert. I'm kind of versed in gear. If anybody has any questions, any strategy, kind of how we approach whether, my strategy in Idaho is not to spike out until we find a good area. I'm usually, go ahead.
Do you have any special strategy for early in the season when they're really not talking?
A lot of cow calls. I'm 95% Bugles, but if you've got an extreme early season like that August 28th to September 5th, or that October 1st to October 15th, I would say I would use more cow calls then for sure. The herd dynamics is basically the young satellite bulls will round up the herd, take care of them. The big bulls are going to move in and run the herd for September. And then as cows are coming out of estrus, if they're coming in their second cycle, third cycle, the big bulls are going to kind of branch off and start roaming again. Those big bulls are looking for cows that are ready, that are calling. So I would use a lot of cow calling. Some guys say you should use older cow calls because they're going to come in the cycle first, but I've never got that too into it as far as sounding like an old cow.
How far do you back in?
It depends, but not as far as you would think anymore. I used to go just hell and gone from Cartagena, and then I just found a bunch of guys on horses. So I kind of figured out that it's like a 1.5-mile-ish loop of day hunters that go in and give up, and then there's the super hardcore guys and the horse pack hunters that go in 5, 7, 10 miles. So lately I've been sticking like 2.5 to 5. I mean, and honestly I'm solo, so I'd like to. I mean, I've packed bulls out solo 5 miles and it sucks.
Yeah.
So really that 2.5, I've had really good luck in that 2.5 to 4.5 range. Like this year, my mule deer hunt, I'm closer to 6, but we're only like 3 miles in, and there's more elk there than it's crazy. No,
the other great thing on up and down is huge advantage. You don't have to go near as far if there's a lot of up or down involved. Yeah, if you can walk flat, then you're going to have 4 or 5 miles is nothing. But I found even mule deer hunting around here, elk hunting, that if you throw in 1,000 foot of elevation, it may only be over a half mile, some really steep slopes. You're going to get rid of everybody again. My typical pack in, ideally when I hunted the goat rocks and stuff in Washington, I was 5 to 7 miles in, moving camp to try to find elk. Idaho last year, camp was our truck, and our goal was to keep moving until we found elk, and fortunate for us, we were able to locate elk within a mile of the road in both spots.
And when we hunted the bighorns in Wyoming, I went in 10, 11 miles and we killed 2 raghorns. It was actually pretty comical. On the way out, we got to the trailhead. I know we were sitting there screwing around, whatever the case may be. A guy came in behind us, and he's 55-year-old guy, huge, like a 340 bull. And I was like, hey, I was immediately in envy. 1, 2, I'm like, holy cow, this guy's 20 years old. Got 20 years on me. His pack was huge, and got the bull off of him. And I'm like, hey, man, where'd you go? Whatever. He goes, oh, I let you dumb young kids pass me. I was only a mile and a half in. We'd been like 10 miles in. He hunted that thing. He was super cool. He had hunted that thing 10, 15 years. And he literally said, dummies like you go a long ways in. Smart guys like me kill elk that you scare to me. So the next year we hunted right where he did. We hunted together is what we did. Yeah. But he had hunted that far. And we ended up going back in and helping him out. But he had explained, many years ago, he started way back. He'd take llamas way back, and he'd kind of been working his way, because he'd gone so far in the beginning, he couldn't really start, seeing what it was like farther. So he was working closer and closer in, and all the elk ended up being a mile and a half from the road. And that guy had he probably had 13 photos of bulls between 280 and 310 that he had taken out of that spot. And quite honestly, like he said, as far as giving us crap about the young dumb guys, he's like, well, that's how you get to be an old smart guys from doing dumb stuff. And he had been very clear on the fact he started out about 10 miles in, just like we were. And you always figure the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. It's generally the case, but not with backpack hunting, not all the time.
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate. My new hunting partner, Charlie, he always says multiple times as we're walking away from the truck, he's like, as soon as I can't see my mailbox, we're too far. So it works out good. And it's like, hey, if we can't hear the truck, we're too far. But no, mile or 2 miles, I like to go deep. I like that feeling of being, basically relying on my gear and what's on my back. But
it depends on what you're trying to do. For me, especially now that I've turned into a photographer as much as I am a hunter photographing guys' hunts, we'll hunt the place as much as we're hunting the elk. We may be able to kill elk a mile and a half in, but if it's a really cool, a much cooler area or whatever to hunt 5 miles in, we may go 5 miles in. Or if we have a mule deer and an elk tag both, mule deer, they're not hanging out a mile and a half in where we go. They're usually 13,000 feet above the mountain goats. But sometimes it's the area as much as it is the animal.
Yeah, there's just something about being above the trees rather than, everybody looks for that elky ground, which is, alpine, subalpine, beautiful meadows up top, but killing elk and wanting to be in great country are a different thing. I mean, albeit there are a lot of places that you can go find elk, like Aaron said, up feeding at 13,000 feet. But a lot of the places we hunt, it's like, this does not look elky. You can't see any food. I can't see 3 feet in front of my face, but it's loaded with elk. And so if my goal is to kill an elk, I need to be there.
I've probably killed 50 or 60 elk, I guess, with cows. So they give a lot of cow tags away in Colorado. Last year was the first year or 2 years ago was the first year I ever killed an elk in an aspen grove, which is what I always figured I'd kill elk in. It's the first time I'd ever shot one in there, and that's out of quite a bit of elk.
What's your opinion on moon phases?
I've only got a set, like my vacation's planned. I try to pick somewhere in that middle 2 weeks of September. It is what it is. I mean, I don't change anything because of moon phase. I'm sure it does have some effect. Clear skies, they do a lot of their rutting activity at night. If there's a full moon and they can see, they're going to be going to bed earlier, maybe coming out to feed later in the afternoon. But I don't put a whole lot. It's not going to change anything I do because of the moon phase.
As far as spark and rut or...
Yeah, I mean, it's all based on photo period, so it's length of day regardless of what the moon's doing. That rut's triggered basically for us here in Oregon, Washington. My days have always been like September 12th or 13th is when the switch is flipped. It just seems, everybody may have different experience, but seems like that's kind of when things get ramped up, and then September 25th to 30th, things are starting to go down up in Western Washington where we're at. It sounds like some of these Rocky Mountain bulls more, or the Cascade Roosevelts, they seem to keep going more into the middle of October. They'll stay, rutting pretty hard. So I don't put a whole lot of change or thought into the moon phase. Anybody else?
What does it take for clothing? I mean, I got horses and mules, so I pack whatever I want.
Yeah.
Sometimes going 6 miles out of camper.
Yeah, no, for sure. I stick pretty much, if I can get nylon pants, merino tops. I don't use a whole lot of down. So like if I was to pick an ultimate system, leaving companies and bias and all that stuff out of it, it'd be Piranha Zion pants or the First Light guides, First Light merino base layers, or whoever the case may be, but merino. Probably the Kuiu Chugach rain gear, followed by the Odie rain gear. One of them's made from Torrier fabric, one of them's made by Event. And then as far as insulation or puffy jackets would probably be the First Light's pretty good. The one that we make at Kafaru's pretty good. There's a Brooks Range Mountaineering that's a down jacket's good. The thing anymore, just like bows, I've been overseas and looked at the factories, and for, not to get in a huge debate, a Chinese kid could have drank too much the night before, and you could have a Sitka sleeve with a cryptic body and a First Light collar. It's all sewn in the same spot. Now, I'm not saying they're all sewn in the exact same spot, but once you go over there, the same people will work in multiple different factories. Those guys, they work a lot of hours. So as far as quality and everything else in clothing, and I've used them all, it's all really high quality. A lot of it's fit. A lot of it, as weird as it is, we're all manly men. We want to look cool. So a lot of us go off of, well, I don't know how many people buy a Kuiu pack because it's colored in Vias camo, but tell me I'll buy a Kafaru pack when you see I sell it in Vias. I mean, whatever floats your boat, but there's a lot of brand-specific loyalty or blind loyalty to gear anymore, yeah. I would say, where I'm kind of gone the other way. On the sheep hunt, I had, I think, 6 different camo or clothing companies on at one time because I just wore what was most comfortable for me. So.
Yeah, my system's similar. Good pair of boots, high-quality merino socks. I wore Smart Wool forever. Aaron talked me into running Darn Tough or First Light, which I'm really liking. I want some sort of a stretchy pant. I used to hunt in Microtex a lot, which doesn't have a lot of stretch. Been kind of spoiled, so I want some sort of movable pant, whether it's, I prefer nylon, 4-way stretch nylon, or, a poly pant like the Sitka Ascents or the mountain pants. And then my upper system is a wool, a lightweight wool, so that I typically hunt in September with nothing else on top of it. I have a vest usually to knock the wind down in the morning. I have an insulative layer, the First Light puffy, and then I've got a rain gear. I don't have a whole lot of room for I don't have a need for a soft shell jacket. I don't know what I would do with it. It doesn't really fit into my system. So for me, it's wool, some sort of vest to knock the wind and add a little bit of warmth, a puffy to add a bunch of warmth, and then a rain jacket to weather out a storm.
I think I just wrote actually an article. I was telling Jason about it earlier, but something when you're in combat, you have a resource to kill ratio. So if me and you us as a 3-man team, they can send us in, and we can take out 75 enemies with just M16s, and then we send him in with some newfangled $190,000 piece of equipment, and he takes out the same as as we did. The resource to kill ratio is screwed. It's heavily swayed, not to talk about Afghanistan. Well, if your gear costs $20,000 and you shoot an elk every 10 years, your resource to kill ratio sucks, right? It's just not very good. And so once you start breaking down the statistics, it's really easy to rub snake oil on gear, where when you really break it down, the difference in, quantifying the difference is almost impossible to a comical level, let's say on rain gear, right? Rain gear, the only thing really waterproof is Helly Hansen Impertech rubber rain gear. So they talk about breathability, and I've been lucky enough to go and watch all rain gear tested in a lab. And when you test rain gear, you've got 2 numbers. One's breathability and one's waterproof. And it's the amount of pressure it takes for one to breathe and one to leak. And they take A good example would be this container. Below this would be air. You put the rain gear here, you seal it off completely. They basically, it's like a fart almost. They blow air through this. You can see how much air is leaking and how much is breathing. Well, what you'll soon find out is none of it really breathes at all, and there's no way you can cheat that system. Now, some of it may fit better and some of it may breathe a little bit better, but you're talking fractions of a percentage. It is so minute that it doesn't really matter. But pit zips matter. Those help. So you want rain gear with pit zips. If you're going to be, for example, and I'm friends with the Cryptic guys, but the Cryptic Caldo, when I did the testing for that in the lab, it held like 15 pounds of water at one time. Now, it took a long time to get to that point, but if you're really going to get geeked out, and this is what I do anyway, that 15 pounds for a rain jacket is pretty heavy. That's how much water it sucked in. You take like the Kuiu Chugach is amazing rain gear. It works really well. It's fairly durable for what it is. It's got pit zips. You know, it's good, but it's also, how much is Kuiu rain? Anybody know who? I'm sure some of you guys have Kuiu hats on. What's their rain gear cost? 600 bucks? Is it 550? Basically, the stuff I got issued when I was a contractor was Odie is the same thing. It's the same price. There's no difference. So you're going to pay, when you get good rain gear, you are going to pay, you're going to pay quite a bit. It doesn't matter what it is. So without rambling too much more, the only thing I'd other talk about is down and synthetic. I would never wear down in Oregon or Washington. I don't care what anybody tells you, any sales ad. Hydrophobic down goes flat really fast. Like we had 2 guys almost die in the territories last year from running hydrophobic down. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it helps. But when I talk about rubbing snake oil on something, if you've ever gotten down wet and it takes 10 days for it to dry, and they say, hey, hydrophobic down dries 30% faster, you're going to die, right? It's common math, right? So it does help some, but synthetic, you still stay warm when it's completely wet. Yeah. So anyway, anybody else have any other questions on clothing or anything else?
You guys both talked about wearing gaiters. Do you have a preference on this?
I don't know. Whatever somebody sends to me.
I bought OR Crocs way back in '07. They're noisy for a bow hunter, but they work and they've held up and they're 100% waterproof, and I'm not scared to run through brush in them. But they are noisy if you're spot and stalk mule deer hunting. But for elk hunting, a lot of times what I do is put them on to get to my hunting spot, and then I take them off. Or if there's a spot I can unvelcro them without being noisy.
The gaiters too, as far as outdoor research, they are the best. But Outdoor Research is a company that's got an unbelievable warranty. They're unbelievable people. I know a lot of them personally, and they dump a lot of money into the military. Like they fund a lot of stuff for the military. They're not really anti-hunting and they're not pro-hunting. They're kind of mid-road, but they are a good company to deal with. Anybody else? I think we should probably start giving stuff away.
Give stuff away so the boat tech guys can go home tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's give some stuff away.
All right.
I'd like to thank Mountain Ops, Onyx Maps, Kafaru, Phelps Game Calls, and Bowtech for giving all the giveaways tonight.
All right, friends. Thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Don't forget about our deal with Mountain Ops. Type in the word gritty at checkout and get 20% off until the end of the year. For those of you who have not seen the Full Draw Film Tour this year and want to go, check out their website for their tour schedule. And if you haven't done so, go and subscribe to our YouTube channel or to the Gritty Bowman TV podcast on iTunes or Podbean so you can see all the latest video content we have produced. And be sure to have a look at the new Elk 101 website where you can find our podcast and other great elk hunting content. Thank you for taking the time to leave us your feedback. We really appreciate your sincere support of our show. Finally, let me leave you with this quote by President Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1905 said, "In a civilized and cultivated country, wild animals only continue to exist at all when preserved by sportsmen. The excellent people who protest against all hunting and consider sportsmen as enemies of wildlife are ignorant of the fact that in reality, the genuine sportsman is by all odds the most important factor in keeping the larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination." Friends, always take the time to educate those around you about your role as a hunter in preserving the wild creatures of this world. If you don't, who will? As always, good luck on your hunts and stay gritty.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to The Gritty Bowman.
Gritty Bowman.